I think everyone's here. Can everyone hear me in the back okay? All right, excellent. So I'm honored to be here at RVAsec. Thank you all for coming out. I actually wanted to present here for my first talk because RVAsec is what got me into pen testing, and I wanted to give that same thing back to the community around here. With that said, this is my talk from web app to ATM. This is a technical discussion about a penetration test I performed that involved an app that managed some ATMs, and we're going to go into why some very basic security issues that were missed by automation allowed a complete takeover. So with that said, just a little bit about me. I go by Deltron on Twitter. I currently work at Walmart doing application security testing. That's where I got the content for this talk. Previously, I did some consulting and red teaming. It was with Sigil and Synopsys. They've got a booth here. You might have seen some of them. And I did blue teaming with a couple of the folks actually out in the crowd here for years before that. And I also like playing paintball. I don't know if anyone else plays paintball. It's a great sport. We took 4th place in our last tournament, which is a lot better than 8th, so we suck less. And I love video games. I know I'm not alone on that one, at least. So boilerplate disclaimer here. All the thoughts and opinions expressed in this are mine, don't necessarily reflect those of my employers past, present, or future. And just a little agenda about what we're going to be talking about today. Like I said, this is just another web app pen test for me. That happened to manage some ATM stuff, but they didn't tell us anything interesting that it was going to do. It wasn't supposed to do like any admin type things, right? Automation tools that had been used, both on my end and allegedly before the test was given to me, had missed some major issues that we're going to cover. And I do want to point out, I don't hate automation because it's probably going to sound like it throughout the talk, but I'll try to point out some of the positives as well. And I totally screwed up during this, and I'm going to cover that because complacency will kill you in this industry. Oh, come on, mouse. There we go. All right, so a little bit about our target. Like I said, this was a web app used to manage these ATMs. They had disclosed a little bit because this was a gray box test. They said, hey, there's 2 roles. One's like an operator that can prepare the ATMs to receive cash. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but that's what they said, but not take cash out of them. And then a manager who can run like boring reports and stuff nobody cares about. And those were split between 2 different portals. And before we jump into the actual test itself, just a little bit about the pen test lifecycle for anyone that's not familiar. You pretty much have a recon phase and then a scanning phase, and then your goals are to gain and maintain access and then cover your tracks. In the case of these kind of gray box or white box web app tests, we can pare that down a little bit. You generally don't do a lot of recon like open source intelligence gathering. You're not going out on Shodan. You're not doing a lot of that, and especially because most of the time these aren't internet facing anyway. But, and also you don't really worry about covering your tracks because you're not going for stealth in this case. You're just trying to find vulnerabilities, you're fuzzing, you're being loud. So the main goal still remains though, to gain access, whether it be admin level access in the application or access to another user's account, and then to maintain that access. So it could be creating another account that has admin level access. And there's a common saying, and it's really more for NetPen, but it applies here as well. And that's if you have 2, you have 1. If you have 1, you have none. And so that's your levels of access. You always want to get an extra one. Again, not as important most of the time in these white box tests, but if you can prove it, it always looks better to your client that, hey, look, I could maintain access to your application at this level, make it harder to eradicate me. So this was kind of the automation out of Burp here, ActiveScan. It came across some things. This was pretty much all false positive here. That cross-site scripting wasn't even real. And so, like I said, they had apparently run something, I don't know what, before the test was given to me. And then the tooling I was using was not really giving me anything interesting. So I wanted to know, where do I go from here? Obviously, this didn't provide me any places to go look. A lot of things that I like to use things like AppScan and Burp for is to go and say, hey, look, these inputs were reflected, and then take that and say, all right, can I elevate that into an actual XSS? In this case, that wasn't available, but I decided to go ahead and do my next favorite thing, and that is Spider. So the Spider, if you're not familiar with those, they just go out and they crawl every link, just like Google does and everything, and they'll pull out like commented URLs and things like that and put them in a hierarchy for you. This is great. I find lots of things with spiders. In this case, while I was logged in with my account, I didn't see any kind of like manage your account, change your password, anything like that. So the spider actually picked up on this change password method that was out there. And so I said, all right, let's go look at that. And to the point of not bashing on automation, this actually helped me a ton because this ended up being a vulnerability. And this, I could have found this URL. It was in an AJAX request. I apologize if it's a little blurry up there. It was a commented out AJAX request when I logged into the web app, and I would have never seen that because, like, you know, yes, in CTFs we go and we read the source code and try to find like a comment with an admin password. That stuff doesn't really happen in the real world often, so we don't make a point to really look through it. And this is another place you rely on those tools. They have like passive scanners that are looking for comments exposing things and whatnot. But we're never going to read through all of this because there's too much of it. So I said, hey, let's go and actually try to hit this change password function. And it threw everyone's favorite low priority finding on every pen test they've ever got, a stack trace or other verbose error message. In this case, it's because I tried to issue a GET request to it because I just put it right in my browser bar. Obviously, it was not expecting a GET, and fortunately, the reason we actually do report these verbose errors is because, in this case, as an example, it tells me exactly what it is looking for. And so I built a post with the JSON array, and you might be able to kind of read it down there, but it kind of cut off a little, sorry about that. But it basically, the function is expecting 3 strings, and with that, that's the first part of the problem here. So I went and built a request. Those 3 strings were, what's your username, and what do you want your new password to be, and confirm your new password. Obviously, that's a bit of a problem. Why didn't I need to know what the old password was? And for anyone that's ever captured requests with a web app before, you might also notice there's something in the response there, but it isn't in the request. There's no session ID. I don't have to be authenticated to hit this thing. And I just told it, hey, I'm admin and my new password's 1. So yeah, that was unauthenticated. So at this point I know, hey, I can reset any user's password on this app without logging in, and I don't think I mentioned it, this application's internet facing. I also found out, I don't have a picture of it, but I could enumerate the users based on errors. So that's another favorite low finding in most cases. You commonly see it when you have like a password reset function, and you'll get a finding in your pen test report, hey, when I go and I put in a non-existent email, it gives me a different message than if I put in an existent one. Well, in this case, it was literally on the change password function that I would get a certain 500 error if the user didn't exist, and if they did, it would just throw an error if I didn't, you know, well, actually, as long as I put some string in the password, in this case, it would let me, but yeah, so that was basically a total compromise, end of talk, right? So from there, I said, okay, I forgot to point it out, but there was actually in the response on that change password, it had a little URL parameter and it said management, if you caught that. So I said, what is that? I logged in with the admin account I reset because why not? That's definitely going to have access to extra things. And I found that there was an account management page in there, and it actually lets you create accounts. Well, not surprising, that's a totally normal admin functionality. And I was wondering, is that restricted in any way? And so I logged out and I cleared my cache, and I said, let me just try to forcefully browse straight to that account creation. It didn't work, oh good. But I set my session ID to my standard operator user, and that worked. So this is a typical authorization problem. I see these all the time where, strangely though, I don't usually see them where one page has no authorization and then another page does, but it's not actually properly implemented. So that was a little interesting in this case. But I did find out, okay, so now I can also just create any user I want. And it took a little guessing with some of these parameters, like the role and all. And by a little guessing, I mean I was lazy. I just logged back in with the admin and captured the request when I made an account the right way. And so yeah, always be looking for those kinds of opportunities to use the built-in functions to do things and just borrow the information you gain from those. It's helped me a lot, and it saves you a lot of time. Why figure it out the hard way when you can just replicate a proper request, right? So then I said, because there was two different portals. The reporting portal, when you logged in, you didn't see all of this. You just had like a little button that was like, run a report, and you could list a start and an end date. And so this was when I logged in with that admin account I reset. You can see there's a bunch of ATMs here. There's like cash recyclers. I'm not even sure what those are, but it's got cash in the name, so it sounds good to me. And this was also kind of where I screwed up. I had logged in with this, and I did not enumerate, but we'll touch on that a little bit later down the road. And I kind of said, okay, what's going on behind this interface? This, if you're not familiar with, or if you don't recognize it, that's a Silverlight application. That's running locally in my browser, but obviously all of this data is stored somewhere else. So I went back to Burp and I intercepted my requests, and I wanted to see what kind of web traffic was happening. As it turns out, no surprise, there's an API behind it, and it happens to be using SOAP. I wasn't really familiar with SOAP APIs. Most people use REST. I actually didn't know anyone still used SOAP, but more or less it's just XML instead of JSON in your requests. To put it very simply. And I wanted to know at that point, what all can I do with this, right? Obviously, I've got a few requests I can capture when I'm logged in with my reporting manager, but not much. Well, SOAP actually has a definition file that can be hosted. It's called a WSDL. I forget what that stands for. It's something like Service Definition Language or something, but they're wonderful. They actually build out the XML for you and tell you exactly what you need to submit in your requests to the API. And that can be a totally legitimate thing. You might not want to expose all your critical things in it, but it's not bad. And there's some tools that make it even easier. There was a plugin I used for Burp called Whistler, and basically it just broke out the WSDL for me and made the request so I could just submit them without having to hand type it all. There were some interesting functions in that WSDL. There was things like add amount for PAN. If you're not familiar, PAN's a financial term for primary account number. Add management card. I don't know for sure what that is, but it sounds like a card that you would walk up to the ATM and use it to interact with it in a elevated way. And there was some others in here that were really good. I don't think they're in the screenshot, but it was stuff like change threshold for withdrawals. So at this point, I can set an arbitrary amount of money in any account number I make up on these ATMs that this API manages. And then I can say, hey, let me encode a card with that account number, walk up to the ATM, maybe modify the threshold because generally, an ATM only lets you withdraw a certain amount of money, and pull however much I want out of there. There's even an ATMs by city. They gave me straight up geolocation data on where all of their ATMs were, so I could drive around town and steal all the money out of all of them. That's great. I mean, I guess not great for them, great for my wallet. And so I was thinking, surely this API is at least authenticated. We did have to log into that Silverlight application. It did submit some kind of authentication when I did that and checked it, but the rest of the API doesn't care. There's no bearer token in here. There's no API key down in the XML data. This was actually me submitting a request to find out how much money is in this random PAN number I had created. As it turns out, I put $100 in that one. I should have gone higher. So yes, no authentication at all. That's about the worst thing you can do to an API that does anything critical. That's more or less how I was feeling about it. And then one last thing that our spider had found for me, because I love that tool, there was this static page just sitting out there. And I love information disclosure, but this one was excellent. It has, you know, your IPs to your MongoDB, your RabbitMQ setup, and I did have to redact it, but the MongoDB string down there actually contained the username and the password for it, in addition to its internal IP. If I'd had scope beyond, if this was a net pin, this would have been a perfect find right here, and that's why you always want to really dig through when you're doing that enumeration and take notes of things like this. In this case, I did not get to use that intel, but if I was actually breaking into their network, I guarantee that thing's used on every Surface account they have. You know, every admin does that, especially at small shops like this was. So we had some other things that we tried and didn't work out. I wanted to bring them up because it kind of helps to reinforce the idea of always looking for more attack vectors, which is really what I want to drive home the hardest. And so there was a method on that API that I found out could take a UNC path, because every Microsoft program ever likes to do that, IIS not excluded. And so I said, what's something interesting we can do? Now, I don't really do NetPin, so I was like reading an article around the same time, as it were, and that was great. And I found out about this tool called Responder that's great for grabbing SMB hashes. And so I said, hey, let me just give this thing a UNC path and fire up Responder on one of my external hosts. And I just pointed it at my host /$, and I was trying to get it to, you know, evoke authentication request and grab those NTLM hashes and, you know, crack them as proof of concept. Well, it didn't work in this case. I got some really weird responses in Responder that were not NTLM or LM hashes at all. I don't know what it was. It like said beehive. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. But the more interesting one that almost worked was they had another method that would grab WSDL or discovery files from other endpoints within their network, presumably so their systems could stay up to date on what API calls they can make to each other. And so I tried to do an XXE, and that's XML external entities, if you're not familiar. And basically what that does is you use a doc type definition to have the XML parser grab a local file, like, for example, Etsy password, and then print it back out to you in a response. There's other things you can do. That's kind of the most basic proof of concept. Unfortunately, they were saved by grace in the fact that .NET 4.5.2 decided to disable DTDs by default. I'm pretty sure, given everything else I saw, that if they hadn't, it would have still been on. So at this point, we can create create accounts as any user that's authenticated, enumerate every user account in the system, reset any of our users' passwords without knowing their current one, and use their entire management API for these ATMs completely unauthenticated on the internet, which was good enough for me to say, hey, let's go ahead and sign off on this report, send it off. This was where I got complacent, but it was because I had some great findings. I had a complete takeover of their primary functionality and their admin functionality they didn't even disclose to me. I figured, hey, I've got everything I'm gonna find here, whatever. I sent off the report. And that's where I really screwed up from sitting on the high horse. So, as does always with pen tests, they fixed things, and they sent it back, and they wanted me to retest. So, at this point, my scanner wasn't really seeing much of anything still. I decided to run it just for the coverage, because why not? It doesn't cost me anything to just turn it on and let it go while I'm doing other things. And this really reiterated to me a concept I've heard many times that I believe very fully now. It is difficult to bolt on security. Everyone in the InfoSec community knows that. And this really proved it to me. You gotta bake it in early. When I came to these developers and I said, hey, here's all these problems. You don't have any authentication on your API. You don't have any proper authorization controls where you do have authentication. I don't know that they fully understood what I was trying to tell them. I gave them links to OWASP. I tried to help hold their hand through this. But, well, what they sent me didn't quite live up to what they had hoped it would fix. So they put up basic auth in front of the API. I don't like basic auth, but hey, at least it's something, right? And they even thought they were clever. So basic auth, normally the problem with it is it goes in the header of your HTTP request, and it takes your username and your password and just base 64s it, which is obviously not encryption. You can decode that and read it. They were smarter than that. They knew I'd complain about that. They encrypted the string before they put it into the header. Well, that's cool, but there's a little problem with that. You see, for them to be encrypting it, there has to be a shared key, of course. And so that instantly got me thinking, this API was behind a Silverlight application. Silverlight has to push that binary to me. That key has to be pre-shared for me to encrypt this and then them decrypt it. I said, can I just decompile this thing? So I did that. I guess someone saw the string already. Yeah, they actually made their encryption key Taco Taco Burrito, and it was the best thing I had seen ever. So yeah, and this was another place where I really should have looked at this the first time I tested. There were methods in this Silverlight application that were not actually in that WSDL file. With that said, never assume just because you have a list of functions that you have the whole list of functions. You know, we see exploits come out or misconfigurations come out about products where some old deprecated API endpoint is still live and nobody knows about it because the developer who wrote it 10 years ago to debug something, you know, left 8 years ago, and then nobody reread the source because who has time for that? So yeah, there was always more things I could have been enumerating that I wasn't, and I should have pulled this application down and decompiled it and read through it because it's easy, and it would have taken me an hour to find a couple things. So anytime you get that chance to go further, do it, because your enumeration is the key. It's going to help you find every single problem, and a lot of times it's going to actually escalate those other things that you took notes on. Tacos and burritos, man. So I decided to go back and peek into that Silverlight GUI that I had made my big mistake on, because I showed you that screenshot of where I logged in with the admin. Yeah, that's all I did. I logged in, took a screenshot, and logged out, and then I went and looked at the calls in my burp, because I was like, hey, this is more interesting. This makes me feel more like a cool hacker man. It's as close to a command line interface as you can get in a web app, right? So I should have poked around the GUI. I actually recommend anytime you're starting a test, the first thing you do is spend a good 30, 60 minutes, depending on how big the application is, and start logging things, but don't look at it at all. Just go through and click every button you can find every function in the application that you're able to discover, and see what information it leads you to, so that you have that mental map of what you're actually working with. So because I decided to go back in and start poking through all of the various options in the GUI as an admin, because, well, I didn't write it down, I don't think, but I was still able to go and create accounts as any user, because they didn't actually fix that. Because the API can also do it, I found out, not just the other side. And with that, like I said, I went back, I started digging for more, and I found this little thing. File manager. It might be a little small up there, sorry. And this, you can see some IPs here. These are actually IPs that correlate to the ATMs that we saw on that admin screenshot when we first logged in. There's a list of files. There's a bunch of libraries in there and other things that it's not a big deal. You can list them, right? But then there's that send file up in the left. And you can't see it, but if you right-click on one of these files in that list, there are delete and execute. And I was like, okay, that's not good. So this wasn't in the WSDL. Why didn't I find this before? Because I stopped looking. But if I had found this in the WSDL, I absolutely would have jumped down this thing's throat, because it's going to be great. I said, all right, let's shell this thing. And normally I would push like an EICAR file or something, which is a AV test file. It has a signature that flags like every AV. It's not actually malicious. That's normally how you do a proof of concept for like an unrestricted file upload. I had authorization to do more, so forget that. I'm just going to upload a shell. And I said, in lieu of doing that, just to make sure that, I know if they do have any AV, I'll just push the most basic interpreter reverse shell I can that's completely unobfuscated, that every single antivirus known to man has to have a signature for. And that was me making up for the fact I didn't use an EI card. And I was like, this ain't gonna work, This thing's gonna have some kind of antivirus, some kind of host intrusion prevention. No, it uploaded. And so I was on this page and I'm like, all right, I'm gonna give it a minute. I'm gonna hit refresh. I'm gonna see if it's still there. Maybe it caught it when it first wrote to disk and it's showing it here, and now it's deleted. And I refresh a few times and oh man, it's still there. So at this point I'm getting excited. I go start up a listener and I'm like, hey, let's execute it. So I'm practically shaking with excitement. I right click it, I hit execute, nothing happens. And I'm like, well, that sucks, but maybe I'll just try it again. So I ran it again. Yeah, it worked. And the app's running as admin when it executes things on the ATMs on the back end. Great security control. Found out there's actually no antivirus set up on this thing at all. Clearly there's a lax firewall either on the software or hardware end here, because I just pointed this to a random IP that Walmart owned and it connected back to me, no problem. Right over, I think it was port 80, but it doesn't matter. You can, oh, I'm sorry.
Are you then running a shell inside one of the ATMs, or running a shell on
Yes.
the program that's managing the ATM?
The program took my file, pushed it to the ATM I specified, then pushed a call to the ATM and executed the shell on the ATM, or cache recycler, or whatever else back there that it manages. Yes, it came out from their network, their DMZ, whatever they're set up in. I don't know the intricacies of how they had it set up because it wasn't a net pin, but yes. Unfortunately, from here, this would be a prime example of cracking the perimeter potentially. I did not have the scope to go any further into their network, and they were not keen to authorize that scope either. I don't think they wanted it to get any worse, but I really wanted to use that string I found on that static page to connect to some services. Fortunately, this wasn't on the domain, so that at least helps a little, but not much. And yeah, so this was running as admin. I took my screenshot. I, laughed all the way back to my report, and really, this was the total compromise that I should have done the first time. If I hadn't gotten complacent, I would have found this. If I'd taken 5 minutes to poke around that admin GUI instead of just jumping right back to my request because it's what I'm used to looking at, and spent more time enumerating, we would have had this the first time. I wouldn't have to send them another report. This was actually a huge mistake on my part, because now they have to go back, in addition to trying to still fix the things they didn't fix right the first time. I just added a whole new pile of work on these developers, and I feel bad for that. You never want to do that in this industry. I mean, it's good we found it, especially, because it's on the internet and anyone else could find it, but you want to not overburden them. They tend to not be your friend when you do that. So, what do we take from this? Just because you're using nice fancy scanning tools, that doesn't mean that there's not deep flaws that can be very basic. The scanners didn't know that change password function was there. I'm sure that I could have found it, if I tuned something to operate more efficiently, but at the end of the day, I'll be blunt. Your consultants aren't tuning these things heavily. They have 40 hours to work with. They're firing it up with nearly default configs and pointing it at your app. Your internal team doesn't have time to configure them most of the time. They may configure it very nicely to work with your application on something critical, but all of your run-of-the-mill stuff, default config for those scanners. So that's why they miss a lot of things, in addition to, just tools have their limitations. So they also didn't know about that unauthenticated SOAP interface. And there's not really much of a way to know about that unless they try to remove the authentication token, but that wasn't there to begin with. So how is a robot going to know that it's missing, right? It's easy to detect things that are there and faulty if it was submitting, or if it was setting an API key and then you could delete the API key and submit the request and it worked anyway, but it wasn't doing that at all. So it wouldn't have called it out as unauthenticated because it doesn't know. And it took, 10 seconds of looking at it as a human to figure that out. And also, they didn't know about there being a lack of roles outside of the GUI, because as we saw, the admin role in that Silverlight app had a lot of things show up, but it didn't matter because you could just interact with the backend without caring about which role you had. And a little, how do we work to combat this, right? For any veteran testers, you already know all these things anyway, but just keep enumerating, never stop, because when you step back from it, like I did, you end up looking like an idiot and then presenting a talk on it and showing everyone else that you look like an idiot when you did it. And then for anyone new or interested in getting into pen testing, really rely on learning your application that you're testing. Spend time getting to know it. Like I said, take that 30 minutes, that hour, and just poke through all the functions. And learn how your tools work so that you understand what they're doing, but don't rely on their output to have all of the information you need. They will let you down if you do. You will miss huge things like this, because like I said, they told me they'd run something against it before. I don't know what it was, but clearly they didn't look at any of its output, or they didn't manually investigate any of the application. So tools and automation are great. I do love them. They're a very, very helpful addition. Like I said, the spider is like my favorite thing. Anything that can speed up manual tasks, anything that can submit lots of payloads, especially where you define the inputs on those payloads, saves you a lot of time to go back and review the actual output. And yeah, so that's all I got on that part. And so then I kind of wanted to wrap up discussing some resources for those of you that are interested or new to penetration testing. There is the OWASP, if you're not familiar, which I'm sure many of you are. It's the Open Web App Security Project. They have tons of resources on their site for both penetration testers, like guidelines on how to test various vulnerabilities, but also, and more importantly, because at the end of the day, our goal is to help people fix things, they actually have tons of resources for developers. Here's how you, prevent XXEs in .NET, so on and so forth, as well as a lot of conceptual write-up. The pen test standard, this is actually more for NetPen, for anyone that's interested in that. It's actually what I thought I was gonna do when I got into pen testing, and then I got hired by an AppSec company, and I've done AppSec ever since. But the pen test standard is, I would say, even more detailed than the OWASP testing guides. And it's all about NetPen from that whole life cycle, from reconnaissance all the way around to covering tracks. They tell you all about different recon tools you can use, exploit tools you can use, and actually some, I believe it still has like detailed commands in it and everything. That's the pen test standard. It's wonderful. With OWASP, if you are interested in trying out like CTFs, which I do recommend anyone interested in pen testing, check the CTF out tomorrow. That's actually what got me started when I came to RVAsec a few years ago. I sat in on the CTF. I got to meet Rob Fuller, Mubix, if you're familiar with him, and talked to Nick Popovich. I think he's still going to be helping out in there. And they really told me about, gave me advice on how to get started, right? And so that was, again, why I wanted to come back to RVAsec to give this talk. But OWASP maintains projects like Damn Vulnerable Web App, if you've heard of it, WebGoat. They're a bit outdated. There's a new one that came out, I think it was last year, it might have been the year before. It's called the OWASP Juice Shop. And you can find, at that link, you can find directions on pulling it down and installing it. I believe you can get it in like a Docker container or run it as like a Node.js application. But it stands up basically a little private CTF environment for you with a scoreboard, and it pops up and gives you points when you capture the different flags. Most importantly, it actually covers various levels of all of these vulnerabilities and more. So you might get like, okay, I want to learn about SQL injection. Well, there's one that has errors, and then there's one that's blind, which is, of course, more difficult to do manually, and so on, right? So OWASP Juice Shop's great. I will endorse one cert here, and that's just because I really do believe in this one, and that is the OSCP. The biggest thing that doing the OSCP gave me was a mindset. Ironically, the mindset that I betrayed in this, I stopped enumerating. If you go through those labs and you go through that exam, you will learn a lot. It is network penetration based, but it's still just as applicable, I think, to application security, because a lot of the methodology is still the same. And so, when you learn to never stop enumerating, you find cool things. Then you forget to stop you forget and stop enumerating, and you miss cool things too. But the last two places here are also CTF type things. Hack the Box is. It works actually very similar to the OSCP lab. So if you don't want to shovel out the money to check out their labs, Hack the Box is free. It's really cool. They're constantly updating it, and they have like vulnerable Linux hosts, Windows hosts. Some of them are like puzzles. Other ones are, just like straight up use this public exploit so you can understand how to do it. And then VulnHub was, I believe, still around, and that was a collection of just vulnerable VMs that you could stand up on your own. Same idea as Hack the Box, except Hack the Box runs it for you instead of you running it locally. And yeah, so that was that. I did want to mention one other thing before I open up for questions, and that is at Walmart, we are actively looking for more penetration testers of any skill level. So if you have any interest in getting into the industry, please meet me after the talk, or my contact info is up here. I will get your resumes in front of the right people. So, does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns, grievances? I'm sorry? I actually just got notified that we're going into our third validation of fixes. So to answer your question, probably not. This time they promised me they put authorization in. We'll see. I'm sure they put something in. I bet they did it wrong. Yeah, duct tape and hope. Do we have any other questions? Okay, well, I was planning to run a little bit longer. I think I talked a little fast. Sorry for that. Nervous was my first talk. But I appreciate you all coming out. Like I said, I believe the slides will be posted either on YouTube or on the RVAsec site. You got the links in there. I can also post the links on my Twitter or something for anyone that wants to find those. I appreciate you all coming out and giving me your time, and have a great day.